Hi, and welcome back to Just Ask the Question. I'm your host, Brian Karam. And, we have a lot of fun asking a lot of people questions today. I'm really happy to have Norm Ornstein with us. Now, in case you don't know, I'll just read you his bio. A political scientist, emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington, D.C. conservative think tank, co-author, and this is what I like, with Thomas E. Mann. The book is called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. But more importantly, Norm and I are nerd Avengers. So we're going to take a short break to do what we got to do, and we're going to come back. Two nerds are going to talk about politics. Stick around. We'll be right back. Coming back in 3, 2, 1. Hi, we are back. It is Just Ask the Question, and I am your host, Brian Karam. With me, Norm Ornstein. So, Norm, I gave you the big, the intro, but let me just ask just ask the question. The question I want to ask you is, how extreme is American extremism today? There are those who believe that we are entering a phase of fascism. There are those who believe that that's in the rearview mirror. And so that, in fact, that we are full-throated fascists today. So I guess I want to ask you, where do you fall on that?
On the fascism scale, I'm right over there, Brian. In this sense, the book that you mentioned, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, was one that Tom Mann and I did in 2012.
Yeah.
So that's 13 years ago. Before that, we did a book called The Broken Branch in 2006 about Congress. And clearly, Congress is even more broken than it has ever been. But the fact is, in 2012, when we called the Republican Party an insurgent outlier, contemptuous of its opposition of facts and science of the existing order, it was really bad. It's gotten so much worse. The reality back then, at least, was that there were some figures, including party leaders, John Boehner, for example, who was trying to ride herd over the extremists and often had to go along with a lot of that stuff, but knew better. All of those who knew better, all of those who, even in today's world, if you could transport them back 30 years, would be reasonable conservatives, are now either all in on what's become a violent cult or have lost every bit of moral fiber that they had. And so we don't have the safeguards. So bad as it was then, it's worse now. And obviously, 2012 was before Donald Trump.
Right.
Trump didn't start this. I actually would go back and something we can reflect on a little bit. The bitterness that's led to even more political violence, I can attribute a good deal of it to Newt Gingrich deliberately tribalizing us, turning us from being polarized. You can be polarized and still view the opponents as, good people who are trying to do the right thing, even if they're misguided, to being evil and destroying our way of life, and therefore anything justifies terrible action against them. And Trump is an accelerant now. And of course, as you know, it's much worse now than it was during his first term.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. You've opened up so many cans there of worms to look at. Let's start with Trump. I mean, I would go further back than Gingrich. I think you could go back to Reagan and Nixon, but Trump specifically shows up and the speech he made. I guess I want to go over that because I covered his first speech in 2017 in front of the UN in New York City. It was kind of more of the same, but it was far worse. He told every country in the world they're going to hell. I mean, how do you win friends and influence people? What kind of diplomacy is that? Is there anything to take away from this that's hopeful?
No, there isn't. Although, I think it was Maria Bartiromo who talked about how courageous Melania Trump was when the escalator stopped, for actually walking up the escalator. My God, that was just courageous and noble. But other than that, there's nothing positive here. And what we have is a deranged speech, which actually had a lot of his greatest hits, the stuff that he talks about
Yes.
all the time. Um,
It was like a
Ishan,
Trump rally.
yeah, Ishan Tharoor, who's a reporter with the Washington Post, um, tweeted out that a senior diplomat from another country had written to him and said, do Americans understand what kind of a deranged lunatic you have there, or something? That was the gist of it,
You know
and
what
that's
one
the
of them wrote to
reality.
me? What one of them said, one of them sent me a text going, he says we're all going to hell. He goes, I have no desire to go to Washington, D.C.
Well, my response to that would have been, if I were sitting in the room, we're in hell.
Yes.
Um, but the fact is, he is the leader of the United States. Its economy has a huge impact on the rest of the world. Its actions in foreign affairs have a huge impact on the rest of the world. So leaders who otherwise would have walked out or laughed in his face sat there just privately saying to themselves, "Oh my God, what has America done to itself and to the rest of us?" And
Right.
that's deeply unsettling. Deeply, deeply unsettling.
Well, one of the things that I found most unsettling, and you can speak to it probably better than I, but the about face on Ukraine, I don't know if it was an about face or a catch up with with the rest of the world feels, but him now saying that Ukraine can get back all of its territory and then some. I mean, he added, and then, and maybe even more, I think was his wording. Comes at a time after that Alaskan summit where it's quite evident to me, and I lived through the Cold War as you did, that this is the type of brinkmanship we haven't seen since the middle of the Cold War between Russia and the United States. Russia pushing, us pushing back, and I don't know how that Donald Trump is of a serious mind enough to handle what he has engaged in.
Brian, never use Donald Trump and serious mind in the same sentence. Really. Um, having said that,
Oh, I'm telling you.
yeah, we have no idea whether this is a genuine uh, action or move on his part, whether it leads to more action, whether it's going to be followed by another reversal in a little while. What I would say, if we give him as much benefit of the doubt as we can give him,
Right.
he wants deals. He hates the fact that he can't. He said again in his press conference today, as he said in his speech at the UN, I've ended 7 wars, which is, of
A
course,
lie.
utter nonsense, complete nonsense. But, and of course, we have his lickspittles now, including his new UN ambassador, Mike Waltz, saying, well, of course he ought to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Itself, I tweeted out, Mike, no matter how much you try, you will never be a contender in the lickspittle Olympics. But um, he wants to be able to declare victory and say, I brought an end to this conflict. And the fact that I believe he believed that he was so buddy with Putin
Putin.
that after he became president, he could go in and say, Vladimir, okay, that's enough. Let's cut a deal here. And I think he believed that he could cut a deal with Putin that actually would have screwed Ukraine, but where he could do his victory lap and make another pitch for the Nobel Peace Prize. And Putin basically shat all over him and, didn't even do the slightest thing to try and accommodate the notion of sitting down for negotiations. He doubled down on killing more civilians, targeting civilians in Ukraine. And that made Trump look bad publicly. And I think he's upset about that with Putin. But I also believe and continue to believe that Russia's got plenty on him and he will only go so far without having the Russians either show tapes of embarrassing or illegal stuff or talk about the deals he cut with Russian mobsters, or the money laundering he's done for Russian oligarchs. So I'm not convinced he's going to go very far. But I will say, going back to that frame about I'm going to be the peacemaker, I'm going to cut the deal, I'm going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, he's now feeling the same anger at Bibi Netanyahu.
Yes.
And this, I actually think it's entirely possible now that he is going to put enormous pressure on Bibi because they're coming up with this deal on Gaza. I'm skeptical that Hamas would ever agree to any deal that includes what he wants, which actually, from the on the surface, is quite reasonable and good. Pull out all the hostages, end the fighting. Gaza will be taken over by a multinational force, including the Palestinian Authority and all kinds of Arab countries. You know, that's something that would be wonderful if it came about. But it's not just Bibi. It's Hamas basically saying we're giving up everything right now. But if Bibi doesn't go along with something like this, and if Trump's pledge that he will keep Bibi from annexing the West Bank, now that European countries are all scrambling to recognize a Palestinian state, I think he could, view Bibi as somebody who isn't kowtowing the way he's supposed to what Donald Trump wants. So we could end up with a different dynamic here than we've seen in the past, at least to some
What do you
degree.
think could happen? Do you think that Donald Trump would advocate for a Palestinian state? Do you think that he would boots on the
Yeah,
ground, or
I don't think he would advocate for a Palestinian state, but I think I could easily see him deciding to uh, jigger around with weapons systems going to Israel.
ooh,
I could see him maybe imposing even some economic, adding to tariffs or doing something else. Or maybe it's just harsh public criticism of Netanyahu and his government. But any of those things would be pretty earth shaking given where he's been before. And of course, it would also create some problems within his own coalition.
so all right, taking together the problems in the Middle East and the problems in Ukraine, uh, how do you feel about it? Is it as dire as some make it out? Do you believe that I had described it as brinkmanship, the likes of which I haven't seen since the end of the Cold War or during the middle of the Cold War? Do you think it's that dire, or do you think this is more easily manageable?
I am skeptical that we're going to see the United States any more than it was under the Biden administration able to impose its will on Russia or on Israel. Um, but I could see us getting into a thicket more than we've seen before. At the same time, let's look at a couple of other elements of what they're doing out there, demanding the return of the Bagram Air Force Base
Yeah.
in Afghanistan, saying we built it when, of course, the Russians built it. But and a laughable Washington Post editorial saying, this is a great idea. We just have a few hundred troops there and we'd have a ability to watch what they're doing. Where the reality, according to every military expert that I've talked to or seen, is that we would need thousands back in Afghanistan. And
Yes.
no doubt some of them would be attacked and we'd be back into the war that he had signed the agreement with the Taliban to get out of. And at the same time, we are openly bombing fishermen from Venezuela. And I
Yeah.
say openly because the initial assertions that these were drug dealers and part of the violent gang, now you've got J.D. Vance, among others, saying, and Trump saying, better not be fishing out there, making it pretty clear that we don't give a damn or have any real knowledge of who's in those boats. And it's, look, I'm not an expert on drug running, but I will say that if you're
What,
going to
Norm? You're not?
be, if you're going to be sending a big load of drugs from Venezuela to the United States, you're not going to do it in a boat with 11 people on board when 9 of them are taking up space that otherwise would go to those drugs. So, my guess is it was migrants. It could also have been something else entirely. We're talking about a 2,000-mile journey or thereabouts from Venezuela to any coastal point in the United States where they might be trying to smuggle something in. And in a boat that size, it ain't going to happen. So, this is just picking fights. And, it brings us back to the main preoccupation of Donald Trump right now, which is behind a lot of the actions being taken, Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes. And that brings me to the thing I wanted to talk about. It is deflection, but it's also two things can be true. It's deflection, and he's also flexing his muscles because he doesn't want anybody talking about anything that he doesn't want to talk about. But where are we in the press in this? You mentioned the Washington Post editorial, which was laughable. You mentioned the Venezuelan situation. We're not reporting on that very well either. And so I look at it, and I look at what he says about us, and I know my opinions from being inside the bubble, but what from outside, what the hell do you think is wrong with the press?
We would need many hours to really go through all of that. I've actually just written a long piece. I'm not sure where it will be published. That goes back to 1997, when I was picked by President Clinton to co-chair a presidential advisory committee on the public interest obligations of digital television broadcasters, which did not end with broadcasters showing any interest in or making any moves towards satisfying the public interest, despite having many billions of free airwaves gifted to them by we taxpayers. But it's gotten so much worse in this era. We are now at a point, Brian, as you know, where 5 entities control about 90% of media.
And soon it will be 4.
Soon it will be 4 if David Ellison, another Trumpy guy, with the billions, many billions of his father, Larry Ellison, having purchased Paramount, making its bid for Warner Brothers Discovery, meaning basically CNN and CBS together, among other outlets. At the same time, we've got Jeff Bezos, who we heralded as a hero when he bought the Washington Post. And we had this idea. We all know what's happened with the business models and the media landscape in the digital era. It's extremely difficult to maintain a newspaper at anywhere near the levels that we've had before. Hundreds and hundreds of local newspapers have bit the dust. Others have been purchased by hedge funds who drain them of their reporters and assets. And then you've got major papers like the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post that have not had a business model alone that can work. The New York Times, to its credit, was savvy owners and management, diversified enough, bringing in the games and Wirecutter and consumer stuff, and using the Daily and its resources in other ways to become profitable. But the others couldn't. And when we had Bezos, one of the handful of the richest people in the world and in the history of the world, buying the Post, we thought, here is a benevolent guy. If the Post loses $100 million a year, that would be the equivalent of Brian Karem or Norm Ornstein having a couple of quarters lost in the couch cushions. And democracy dies in darkness. We're going to be back to a Post that has the courage to push back against oligarchy, to give truth to power. And then, because what's become clear, if you are a multi-billionaire, same is true of Sung and the Los Angeles Times, you didn't make it in the media world. You've got it because you have varied interests that require government assent. And if you have a space business that's competing with Elon Musk and SpaceX, and you have Amazon that needs the post office, that has all kinds of other ways in which it can be devastated by heavy handed government action, and then you pair that with a criminal gang demanding protection money or other obeisance, or the government will come down hard on you. And the result is not surprising. So you've got that combination of a small group of billionaires and multiverse corporations controlling almost all of our media, but having a gun to their heads, in effect, with an administration that, as the Brendan Carr, the chair of the FCC, said to ABC Disney, you can do it the easy way or you can do it the hard way. That's right out of a Goodfellas movie.
It is.
And the implicit threats that can come. We're in a bad place, Brian. And, then, a hobby horse of yours and mine as well, the reporters out there who used to do their job at the White House press corps have become pathetic beyond belief. Sitting there while the press secretary tells lie after lie after lie, doing nothing when one of their own is abused and mistreated by the administration, asking a bunch of questions of Trump without calling out his lies or pushing him hard on anything, knowing that if they do, he will threaten them, as he did with Jonathan Karl of ABC, or remove their access, which is their life's blood. And so we have a bunch of sheep. And, the broader point here is the framers understood that we could slide into an autocracy. They knew that we could end up with a president who would act like a king, and they did not want a king. So they built in guardrails, some of them governmental, an independently elected Congress, an independent judiciary, some of them in the private sector, the belief that if we had all kinds of groups out
Where
there,
they'd screw up.
yeah, go back to Federalist 10, that we would have a press that would hold their feet to the fire, that we would have civil society step up to the plate. And where are the guardrails? Supreme
They're
Court,
gone.
that is, Amy Coney Barrett said laughably when she was standing next to her patron, Mitch McConnell, at his institute in Kentucky, we're not a bunch of partisan hacks. Well, there's 6 partisan hacks there that are now basically creating a king and defiling the Constitution and the will of the framers. And we have a press corps that is either in
Complicit.
Trump's pocket or basically not doing its job.
Well, I think I point that out in my book, Free the Press. Shameless plug. But I believe that it began with Ronald Reagan dismantling the fairness doctrine and then allowing multiple ownership of media. So you have the Sinclairs that you used to be limited to, was 4, I think, and then 7 that media properties you could own. You couldn't own the Courier Journal and Louisville Times had to break up and sell WHAS because they couldn't own the television and newspaper in the same market. So you had back in the day the ability to break up the media monopolies, but we don't do that. And I firmly believe that if you're going to be successful, you got to break up the media monopolies. You've got, look, I don't know if you read the University of Chicago study recently that said, you pointed out 5 companies, 95% of what we see, read, or hear at a national level. But the most disparaging, most sobering thought was the University of Chicago study, I think, that Paul Ferry was involved with from the Washington Post, that showed that 45% of the counties in this country, that's nearly half, 45% of the counties do not have a local media source. So that to me is it. And in those, Donald Trump won 91% of them in 2024, and many of them by landslides. Now, some of them are very small, but the government used to give tax breaks and tax incentives to small companies that owned media. They don't do that anymore. They don't even publish the public notices in newspapers anymore. There's no support for local radio. There's no support for local, as far as streaming or podcasting. None of that. There's no support there. It is the oligarchs who own 95% of what you see, read, or hear are in cahoots with government, who put the gun to their head. You can make the profits, but we get to make the decisions. And that to me is anathema to free press. I don't know if there's anyone in government right now with Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting panache who would come after and bust up the media monopolies. But until you do, I don't think there's any way that we could free the press and get back an independent press. And that to me is frightening, because it does not bode well for our democracy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I make two other points. One is those rural areas often would rely on public broadcasting, public television for storm warnings, for education for their kids.
Not anymore.
And of course, Trump's blown that up. The second point is, putting those five aside for the moment, we have social media. Who owns the social media now? We have the big ones, Meta and X, I'll still call it Twitter, owned by oligarchs who will kowtow to Trump. You no doubt saw that when Trump had his dinner at the White House with tech executives, Mark Zuckerberg sat next to him and said, "Mr. President, Meta, my bigger company, is going to invest $600 billion in the United States by 2028. And then was caught on a hot mic saying to Trump, "I didn't know what number you wanted me to use. Was that one okay?" So it's all a bunch of crap, but they're just kowtowing. And Meta now basically putting back on the platform agents of deliberate misinformation and disinformation, and no doubt, as it did before, welcoming in Russia and its disinformation with open arms. Now you've got that the next point, TikTok. So we have a major platform for younger people, the source of news for large numbers of people out there, China owned, a law that said it had to be broken up, and a ban on it. It gave a brief period for the president to waive that ban. He's now violated the law multiple times, and now has cut a deal with China where it's Peter Thiel and David Ellison and Larry Ellison and other pro-Trump multi-billionaires who will be controlling TikTok. So we have Trump's allies basically running and manipulating social media, even as these five giants control 90% of the other kinds of media. It's getting worse by the moment.
Well, and it's not really independent. This is all right. So you complain about the reporters. We could do hours on this. So you complain about the reporters. That's because the companies in their greed are hiring people with less and less experience. Sure. And they flip them over. And you used to be, you have 10 or 15 years of experience to get into that briefing room at the White House. Now you're hired straight out of college, and then they boot you out or dismiss you and hire somebody cheaper. That's the oligarchs doing that. The companies also have, I have hired and fired, mostly fired, thousands of fact checkers and, of course, editors, copy editors. So today, what passes for journalism is not what would pass for journalism when I was a kid. And as far as the internet, the anonymity of the internet and the proliferation of bots means that anyone can appear to be an expert or present evidence or information that is misinformation and disinformation. And those who have, like you have experience, I will listen to you, but I'm not going to listen to a kid straight out of college or someone who doesn't have their degree in it and just merely saw a couple of TikTok videos and say, in my opinion, it's this and this and this. The online journalism is not journalism. It's what we're doing here. It's two people talking. It is opinion based. The actual presentation of vetted factual information has just dissipated. It doesn't exist. So getting facts, getting vetted facts, you're entitled. Everybody says we're in the business of providing the truth, and I disagree. Journalism is in the business of providing facts, vetted facts. And you decide from those facts that we all mutually share and agree upon what your truth is. There are 4,000, different religions on this planet, each one with its own truth. But facts have to be, vetted and immutable. And I don't see that anymore. And that is the most frightening thing that I find today as a byproduct of social media.
And I would say the norm is not we're going to say the truth. The norm is we're going to show both sides. And the insidious element to this is
that does a disservice too.
It's false equivalence, of course, a term that was, I think, really coined for this purpose by James Fallows, one of the great veterans of journalism. But what we're also seeing now is an unbelievable double standard. The desire to normalize the Trump administration and treat it as if maybe it's a little bit at the kind of boundaries of what's normal, but as a normal or typical administration, to look at Trump's verbal stumbles, misstatements, flat out lies, and treat them like any other president would be treated without examining them, but not even doing a quarter of what they did when it was fact checking or holding the feet to the fire of the Biden administration.
Right.
And, of course, we see this a lot on some of these social media platforms where Trump will say something utterly ridiculous or stupid or talk about a war between two countries that are 1,000 miles apart. And
An armed war.
It gets ignored or reported, and as if it were a normal statement. And, you use the template all the time. If Joe Biden had said that, 10 reporters would immediately have raced to the phone to call their agents to get a book proposal in on a president losing his faculties. And we got none of that with Trump. They treat it as if it's perfectly fine. And so you've got to, let's face it, we have an audience out there that includes a number like us who are avid media consumers and look across a lot of stuff and can suss out facts from fiction, from distortion, from non-facts. You've got a lot of others who cocoon in on a kind of media that just feeds them non-facts and untruths.
They stay in their own informational silo. Yes.
Right. And then you got a huge number of others who just don't pay much attention to any of this stuff. And if they're living their lives, many of them are being harmed directly by the reckless actions of the Trump administration, but they're not going to have any sense whatsoever that this is out of the norm or out of the normal. And that is a failure. I would say part of the failure is on Democrats in Congress and in states for not finding ways to counter it. We know that a part of it, too, is, as Steve Bannon said back in 2015, we know how to control this media. We flood the zone, scandal after scandal, outrage after outrage, and they can't handle it. So they just let it all go by. And the way you counter flooding the zone is you focus on one outrage and pound away at it. Everybody in every possible outrage.
Jeff Epstein.
Yes.
Jeff Epstein.
And, Jeff Epstein, rural hospitals closing, healthcare being taken away, food safety thrown out the window. There are so many of these. You do a week on them. One of the things that I've wanted Democrats in Congress to do is to start to use the impeachment weapon. I know it's a dirty word and it's been misused. The Republicans in Congress went to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas, one of their then stars, a guy who's basically pretty good. Mike Gallagher said, no, I'm not going to vote for this because there's no high crime or misdemeanor. and they drummed him out of Congress, basically. He left in the middle of the term over that. But impeach Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's a privilege resolution. Mike Johnson can't keep it from coming to the floor and have 20 whereases, 20 impeachment clauses stopping the war on cancer and clinical trials, spreading misinformation about autism, blocking vaccines, and allowing 2 kids, infants, just died of whooping cough in Louisiana because
And
we've
we have
had,
more, what is it, more measles now than we've had in 50 years.
yeah, and we're gonna, who knows before polio comes back. We are ill prepared for the next pandemic. Impeach Pete Hegseth for what he's doing to undermine national security. And if you do this, it's going to have to be covered. They can't ignore that. And frankly, you either going to get Republicans in the House who are going to have to vote,
Yeah.
even if it's a vote to table. They're going to have to vote in a way that would say, we're okay with what RFK Jr. is doing. We're okay with what Kristi Noem is doing. We're okay with what Brendan Carr is doing. We have to find ways to get this information that the press is not going to give them, that doesn't exist anymore. And even where you have local broadcasting, somewhat local broadcasting, you mentioned Sinclair before. Sinclair has taken its 100 stations and put together nationally right-wing propaganda in the form of opinion statements or news stories that they put out, deceiving the viewers, especially an older audience that often will get its news from what they think are trusted sources, local broadcasters. And what they're getting is people who they think are their local reporters, but it's propaganda coming from Sinclair. So we're going to have to find ways to counter this. If I will say, if it's true, I saw at least a rumor today that Bob Iger, the head of Disney, who, of course, unconscionably caved right away on
Right.
Jimmy Kimmel and then gave it back, has told Sinclair that if they're not going to air Jimmy Kimmel, they can't air football.
That is stop it.
If that is true, I will stand up and applaud Bob Iger. And the same with Nexstar, which of course is not as ideologically right wing as
Sinclair.
Sinclair, but is as greedy as any because they want their merger with Tegna to go through where they can control 80% of the local television markets.
Yeah. Well, all right. So as we end this time, Norm, one of the things I like to do is talk about something other than politics. I know it's rare, but so if the question I often get asked is, "What do you do to take your mind off of politics?" So I'll ask that of you. What do you do?
So I will tell you this. We have a foundation in memory of my son Matthew, who died in 2015, and he had been a national champion high school debater, and we've created a summer debate camp for public school kids in the Washington
Wow.
D.C. area. We started with 30 kids 10 years ago. We had 267, all public school, nearly all Title I schools from fifth grade through high school that learn debate, free camp, and it's first come, first serve. And they learn life skills, and it's like an escalator up to success. And we did a documentary that's going to be on public broadcasting on March the 6th, which is the National Speech and Debate Day. And we just did a screening of it at the wonderful museum in Washington, Planet Word, which
Wow.
was created by Ann Friedman, Tom Friedman's wife, who's an
Yeah.
elementary school teacher, and it's one of the best museums I've ever been in. We had 170 people at this screening. Judy Woodruff moderated a discussion afterward with
Wow.
two of our star debaters, and one and two filmmakers, and being able to see these kids march to success. We had in the film we feature, for example, one of our kids who is Emmanuel McKinday, who's at NYU and is going to be a doctor, who said, I never would have been able to get the scholarship to come here or the ability to come here if it hadn't been for debate. Another one who's at Harvard saying the same thing. So I'm finding ways to have something good happen and feel good about it.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is Just Ask the Question. I am your host, Brian Karam. Anything you want to plug, Norm?
That's it.
Okay. That's it. We'll catch you. Well, I love how you close. That's it. Yeah. We'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot.
Okay.